My friend's cat, Loki, passed away last year. He was 21 years old and might have been the oldest cat I have ever had the pleasure of meeting. When they let me know, I immediately had an idea that I wanted to create for them, and quickly inked a tiny thumbnail in one of my sketchbooks, and when I had some free time, I penciled up a clearer thumbnail to get the exact position I wanted him to have in the drawing. Thumbnails are one of the most important steps for me when I'm creating a piece. I can quickly see what composition works and which doesn't, and can fine-tune things like the position of his paws and tail. I liked the idea of him floating kind of nonchalantly among sparkles in a deep inked background, but I realised I didn't have much in the way of reference and wanted to make sure it did actually look like him, which resulted me in stalking my friend's social media for photos and going through my phone for a few I'd taken in the past, as I wanted it to be a surprise. I also wanted to feature his name in black letter at the base of the drawing. I'm going to be using Canson illustration Bristol paper, which is perfect for inking. I only recently switched to using this paper and it's so smooth it took a little getting used to, but now I really love using it. I primarily work using a dip pen and ink, so the smoothness of the paper really helps with the flow of the ink, making smooth lines without a break in the flow, and it's just much easier to draw with this paper. And I'm using a calculator to divide up the paper because my mental arithmetic is much worse than my drawing skills, and I'm dividing up the paper to a size that I want. I wanted to make the drawing small enough that if they wanted to tuck the drawing away to look at it when they felt like it rather than displaying it, they could. Grief is a difficult thing, and sometimes in the beginning having reminders around us can be harder, and sometimes we only want to engage in those feelings at specific times or times of our own choosing. I always like to give my illustrations a border, and I find this looks really lovely with the fully inked piece, to see the contrast between the white of the paper and the deepness of the black pigment. I also always mark in very light pencil where the middle of the page is, so that the subject is correctly positioned. Sometimes I will divide up the page more depending on how complex the composition is. This was something I never used to do as accurately or even at all, and I've definitely seen a big improvement in my work since doing this. Sometimes, even when we want to be very creative, it can be good to pull back and look at things from a more technical or analytical viewpoint. Loki has quite the penetrating gaze, and I wanted to make sure I captured this just right. He has a really soft, creamy coloured coat and huge green eyes. Loki was a much loved cat and a very nice one. As always with my drawings, I begin by penciling the details before inking. I think I was a bit more nervous than usual with this part, as I wanted to make sure there was a good likeness. I paid a lot of extra attention to his eyes and expression. I think I did redraw them a few times actually, which brings me on to a downside of this paper. I do find that it stains quite easily from pencil, so if you use it, you need to use very light pencil marks, and so long as my lines are very light, I don't have any issues removing the pencil. So I am all ready to ink. I make sure I am set up with some tissue to periodically clean my nib, my Indian ink, and any reference I might need. One of my favourite things about inking is how simple it is. I can create so much with so little setup. Having been a painter in the past, this aspect of inking is always really enjoyable to me. Although in a way it can be more unnerving because once the ink is on the page, I can't undo it. At this point, when I am inking the outline of the subject, I pay a lot of attention to what texture the subject has. Today we are drawing a short-haired cat, so although they may appear perfectly smooth from far away, I want to make sure I am drawing the edges with lots of tiny smooth hairs resting on each other, so that from far away it may appear smooth, but on closer inspection you can almost feel the texture of the fur. There are also certain parts of even short-haired cats that can be more fluffy than others, and although Loki is short-haired, his fur is very thick and has lots of grooves where the fur separates or clumps together. At this stage, my main goal is to capture all the main and important details that make up his face. I will often leave this until the end after I've filled the background, but because I was kind of worried about the likeness being accurate, I decided to do more detail on the face first, so I could figure out if I might need to start again or not. Usually my work is much more stylistic, as it's just from my own imagination, so I don't need to worry too much about this beyond just creating a face that I like or envisioned, so usually I leave inking those details until the end. I was quite intent on making every part correct, including the paws, and I'm always checking my reference photos to see where his fur gets thicker, or around his belly it's actually very fluffy, and his tail too. In my initial thumbnail I drew from my imagination, the cat is a lot chubbier and fluffier, but Loki is quite slender and elegant, and it was very important to get his fur just right. He somehow needed to look both soft and sleek at the same time. As many people I'm sure can relate, animals play a huge role in our lives and are often the difference between a day being bad and a day being exponentially better. Cats in particular I have always loved, and I guess kind of related to on more of a personal level. I have friends that have often described me as being a lot like a cat, and I've often found them very easy to understand. I like how they are a little bit wild, but also seek us for comfort and, of course, food. I like how they move, being both elegant and kind of silly, ultra-sensitive to the tiniest noises, and will be entertained for hours by a small object trapped under a sofa or in a box. I've always thought cats are very enlightened, not to say that I think I am, but they are incredibly skilled meditators and seem to spend most of their days taking in the moment and being very present, spending time soaking in sunbeams. One of my cats in particular, who will show up to join me in the studio later, gets extremely grumpy when it has been raining for too long, as one of his favourite things to do is to stretch out for hours in the sun unmoving. I think many people misunderstand cats because their body language is quite different or more subtle than more domesticated animals like dogs. But they are also not completely wild, so we hold them to different standards. Their affection can suddenly leave as quickly as it comes, and they will always tell you when they want you to stop doing something. I think this upsets some people, and they view it through a very human lens of rejection, but really I think this is what makes cats so beautiful. They will let us visit their world for a time, and very clearly tell us when they have had enough. I think it says a lot that cats have been so present throughout history, but almost always on their own terms. They have been associated with us for around 12,000 years, and initially were used to keep the population of vermin under control, but unsurprisingly they completely charmed us, and there are records of them even being mummified in Egypt. It was in medieval times that cats became associated with witches, and that may be because of how they were used in ancient witchcraft and paganism, their pelts having been used for their practices, but also the animal itself being revered and often believed to be a witch in disguise, carrying out their deeds. There are several ancient religions that believed cats are here to be companions and guides for humans, as they are the exalted souls. They don't influence the decisions of humans, but they are all-knowing. With my illustrations, I like to use a variety of textures depending on what I think will give the best effect. So I will switch between using stippling, which I'm using for the eyes, which is essentially lots of tiny dots, or I might switch to scribbling, which is one of my favourite ways of filling in backgrounds, to long expressive strokes, which is especially fun for creating fur texture on animals. The only thing I don't really do is cross-hatching, actually. I don't think I have done cross-hatching since I was a teenager. I wonder if I should experiment with that again. I line the border of the drawing often with dots, but it depends on the drawing. I like to avoid hard lines unless it corresponds with what I'm filling the background with. I then outline these background details, which are quite a bit more simple than a lot of my other drawings, that often use a lot more foliage or flowers. But I wanted him to appear to be floating in a sort of celestial space, with the full emphasis of the piece being Loki. And then I begin filling the background. This is actually one of the most relaxing parts, although it can be time consuming, and depending on the complexity of the shading, I don't need to think too much and can usually listen to things while I work. Sometimes I do like to create gradients for my backgrounds, so I might blend the scribbling into stippling and then lighten the dots to create different shades across the paper. But today we are just doing some fun scribbles with some white spaces for sparkles and glowy orbs. I have to clean the nib fairly often and always use a little bit of water and tissue for this. I also find when I'm filling backgrounds I need to stretch my hands frequently and sometimes even change how I'm holding the nib holder so that I don't cause any repetitive strain injuries. I always take quite a lot of breaks to rest my eyes too. Before I start inking, I also always check the nib to make sure there's no fibres trapped inside, as this can ruin the lines. I also make sure my nib isn't getting too flexible, as this will create a thicker line than the one that I want. I also always test my lines before putting any ink onto the piece that I'm working on. When I first started getting back into the medium, I used fine liners, but I was always a bit unsatisfied with them. I actually ended up switching to dip pen because one of my fine liners had run out of ink and I was doing the Inktober challenge at the time. It's a popular online drawing challenge, I think primarily on Instagram, where you're challenged to create an ink drawing every day of October. And because I live in the middle of nowhere, I knew that I would have to find an alternative. Luckily, I managed to dig out some old nibs and a nib holder and immediately noticed a difference. It was at that point I realised I would never go back to fine liners. Probably. Every tool has its place, and you never know when something unexpected might be really useful. Recently I used watercolour pencils to paint a clay doll face I was working on, and I really didn't think I would ever use those, honestly. If you're interested in art dolls, I have a few videos on my channel showing those projects. My cat decided it was completely unacceptable that I was spending time focusing on anything other than him, so he joined me for a while. He was actually born to a semi-feral cat who I met at just the point where I could make her somewhat used to humans, although she would always hiss at me between meowing for food, which I always found really funny. His other siblings from her were two white cats with blue eyes and another with his colouring but short head. His colouring is what is called a colour point cat. It's a form of albinism that is affected by the temperature. It's why their extremities are darker. His coat has darkened a lot as he's gotten older, but I really love his creamy colour. He reminds me of a cinnamon bun. Something I really love about dip pen is the line variance and how once dry you can really see and feel the ink on the paper. It creates a slight texture that I really enjoy. I've also experimented with watering down the ink a bit. I found this is really nice if you're worried about making mistakes, and the lines come out a lot more grey, and you can always draw over the lines again with thicker ink if you want them to be more prominent. It can take a while to get used to the slight unpredictability of dip pens, so I would recommend spending some time experimenting with lines and shading and different nibs to find what works best for you and what feels most comfortable. So I only started editing these process videos that are up on my channel at the beginning of the year, and I don't know if I'll get enough views on this one to incur some feedback. But if there's an aspect of my videos you'd like to see more or less of, I can keep that in mind when I'm filming future drawings and projects. I tried to do a mix of close-ups and further away shots showing me at my desk, but it might be there's something that I just haven't thought of. I'm also playing with the idea of editing together a spring art studio vlog, perhaps. But it depends how the footage comes together while I'm editing. But I think it could be nice to experiment with some footage I have that I don't necessarily want to use for an entire video on its own. Loki might be one of the most appropriate names for a cat. Loki is a god from Norse mythology, but quite different from a lot of our ideas of what a god should be. Loki is a god of chaos, able to shapeshift and often will change their gender too. They are known as a trickster, full of clever plans that often cause a lot of trouble for the gods Odin and Thor. At times they have even been an enemy to them, being the cause of the death of the god Balder. Loki even shapeshifted into a mare in order to birth Odin's shamanic horse. You can find this tale by looking up the fortification of Asgard. During Ragnarok, Loki actually takes the side of the giants rather than the gods and battles against them. Norse mythology has some really beautiful imagery, and if you're looking for some inspiration, albeit quite dark, I'd really recommend reading some. I love the imagery of Loki's son, tied to 3 rocks inside a cave with a serpent forever above him, slowly dripping venom onto his body. His wife sits by his side, catching the venom in a bowl. But when she can't be there, every time he writhes in pain, great earthquakes tremble the earth. One of my favourites is actually a daughter of Loki called Hel. Odin declares her ruler of the deepest of the dark places, the 9 worlds, and of the dead. Queen of those that have met their demise in unworthy ways, according to the gods, that is, those that have not gone through battle but left the living through disease, old age, or childbirth. Hel has 1 sharp green eye and 1 cloudy eye, due to facial damage to one side. She says that she prefers the dead because the living only look on her with revulsion. In that dark place she has a hall where she will receive those that do not make it to Valhalla. There is just something about the imagery this evoked in me that I really loved. It might be that what I imagined isn't even what the interpreters intended, but I imagined this small girl being the queen of the underworld in this great hall, and perhaps I should create a piece expressing this one day. Loki actually has many children, and another of these is his son, who is a wolf cub with dark amber eyes called Fenrir. As Fenrir grew larger and larger, the gods became intimidated. Fenrir became stronger and more vicious, and so they decided to make heavy chains and shackles to permanently bind him, and then tricked Fenrir to think it was a test of his strength, but he broke free of them all. They kept forging new sets of chains until finally turning to the dwarves, who forged chains that would hold Fenrir. Fenrir sensed their treachery, so he suggested that one of the gods put one of their hands in his mouth while he was chained. A son of Odin's volunteered, and Fenrir could not escape the chains, and the gods would not let him go and only laughed, and so he bit down on the wrist and severed it entirely. The wolf shouted to Odin, saying that if they had let him go he would have been a friend to the gods, but now he would seek revenge. He would eat the sun and the moon and would take pleasure in ending them all. Loki's position among the gods is one of ambivalence, which I think is why many find him so fascinating, and why it is such a perfect name for a cat. So I am almost done adding the final details to this portrait, and I'm also touching up some areas of shading, making them a bit darker to add more contrast. And this is the finished drawing. I am Emily, and I am here creating ink drawings, art dolls, and sometimes some other small sculpting projects, and sharing them with you. I have an online shop where I sell prints of my work and an illustrated storybook. If you like these kinds of process videos, then please subscribe, as I have plenty more I am editing to upload soon, and already have a small catalogue going. I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching.